George Bose makes a wonderful introduction, but as we were coming up here, there's one thing he can never remember, which is, did I get my undergraduate degree from Harvard or my law degree from Chicago or the other way around? And after we went over it 2 or 3 times, I think he just got it wrong again. I don't want to defame either institution. It's not of any importance, but I did get my undergraduate degree from Harvard and my Juris Doctor from Chicago. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful auditorium, particularly when I remember the place where I lectured the last time when I was at the University of Florida about 5 years ago in the old gymnasium. And I was on the floor of the gymnasium. They had quite a large crowd, just like tonight, but I had to look up at them. It was as if everybody was in the balcony. The acoustics weren't very good, so physically it wasn't too great. So it's nice to see that they built a beautiful auditorium for my second visit here. Actually, I'm not under any illusions about universities building auditoria for me. In the kind of speaking that I do and the kinds of issues that I raise, I run into a tremendous amount of controversy and a tremendous amount of defensiveness from some university departments when they're asked to sponsor a colloquium that I'm going to participate in, a talk to their faculty, sort of, or whatever. Sometimes there's a lot of touchiness about this. And the organizers of this event told me of one department chairman who, I won't mention the department or the name or whatever, so I don't want to embarrass anybody, who said, well, we don't want to have anything to do with this Johnson. He's a dangerous man. And I thought, that's the nicest thing anybody's said about me. And it really sets up something you have to try to work to achieve. So I'll hope that I can say something that's sufficiently dangerous to merit that accolade. Let me start with one of the most successful books of modern times, a book that was originally printed just 5,000 copies. Within a few years had sold 5 million copies worldwide, and made its author unexpectedly for his publisher too, a very rich person. And this book is called A Brief History of Time by the British physicist Stephen Hawking, a very famous person who I'm sure is known to all of you as the man who unfortunately suffers from what Americans call Lou Gehrig's disease, the muscular degeneration, that has left him not only helpless in a wheelchair, but unable even to speak, so that only with a certain limited finger motion that he has left can he use an amazing computer voice synthesizer and speak as if, as if a machine is speaking. But he is still able to communicate, still has one of the most powerful minds in science, and was one of the most famous scientists in the world. Hawking wrote this book, interestingly enough, because he wanted to make a little money to pay for the tuition for his children's education, as it was getting expensive. And in this book, The Brief History of Time, Hawking tells the story of his own work as a physicist and of his great dream, especially, that physics as a discipline is about to discover the final theory, that it's about to complete its long quest for knowledge and finally really understand the physical world in toto. This great triumph would come, he said, when, as he expected in the fairly near future, physicists were able to come forward with a complete theory unifying the 4 basic forces of nature: electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear forces, and gravity, forces which, according to generally accepted physical theory today, were in fact one unified kind of force at the earliest instance of creation, the earliest instance of the Big Bang, and became separated in the way that they are today later on in the cosmic history. So that if one had this complete understanding of how things were at the absolute beginning, how these forces were unified, then one would have what physicists, often using very romantic or religious language, have called the Holy Grail of physics, the theory of everything, or the final theory. And Hawking waxes very eloquent about the meaning of this theory, not only to physicists, but to humanity as a whole. He says, once we have a final theory of the physical causes of everything, then perhaps we'll be able to communicate this theory to the general public, and so that we'll be able to get everyone to understand at least a part of it. And that can set the stage for a great conversation in which we can come to an understanding of the why, of why the universe exists and of what purpose it serves. And he said if we could figure out that, then that would be the greatest triumph ever for the human mind, because then we would know the mind of God. Now, this very sensational language caught the public imagination. Hawking was on the cover of Newsweek. Television series of really great excellence was made about his life, shown on British television. And as I say, the book sold all of these millions of copies. And you can see what a tremendously attractive vision it offers, really, essentially, of human omniscience. And you can see the kind of knowledge that people want to have. On the one hand, they want to have knowledge that comes from scientific investigation of how everything works, a knowledge which gives, as we've seen, a great power over technology to manipulate things and to make things. On the other hand, they want to know the answer to the why question. They want to know what the purpose of life is. A man like Stephen Hawking, who's gone through so much suffering, wants to know what the meaning of his suffering is. We want to understand, is there really a plan for our lives? Is there a basic standard of right and wrong? Is there an overall purpose to this universe and to this life of ours which we can fulfill? Now, to many people, it seemed extremely naive and questionable to try to link this understanding of the purpose of things to a process of scientific investigation. After all, even if this physics that Hawking was talking about was successful in producing equations which could show how the four forces might have been one universal force at some early time, a goal which I might add many other writers have said is in fact very far away and may not be reachable, even if that could be achieved, however, what would we have but a set of equations? The discipline of particle physics is, in fact, one of the most highly specialized, technical, abstruse, difficult to understand of all human activities. And the idea that people in general could come to understand something of importance in their lives from these equations seems rather far-fetched and unexplained. Moreover, how would one get from the answers to these how questions, these equations that tell how forces work, to the why questions? Scientific investigation for the past 200 years or so has increasingly proceeded by putting aside questions of purpose and asking only questions of mechanism. So if we find out the mechanism, and the mechanism is all there is, all we have is a set of equations about how particles interact. When we find the mind of God, what do we find? Is there no mind there? Or if we're going to find that mind, are we going to have to find it some other way than through investigation of mechanisms? Now, this kind of question, what kind of knowledge do we want to have? How much can we actually learn from scientific investigation? To what extent could we obtain valid knowledge of something like the mind of God from outside of science? These are the great questions of knowledge in any generation, and they're, I think, coming to a particularly strong point of interest in these closing years of the 20th century. Now, to illustrate how questions about knowledge and about the meaning and purpose of our lives come into even the most mundane issues of scientific investigation, of the world around us, I'll tell you a story of another book. Another very successful book, not as successful as Hawking's book, but quite successful indeed. And this is a book called The Beak of the Finch. It is by a science writer named Jonathan Weiner. This book got a tremendous play in the New York Times, in the national media generally, and from what one might call the intellectual elite of the country. The New York Times gave the book a smash favorable review. In fact, all of the reviews I saw in the mainstream media were highly favorable. The New York Times went further than that. It offered the author a full page of the Times to publish a summary of his thesis. which is, of course, the best advertising that a book could possibly have. The only better advertising than that I know that an author ever got was when Bill Clinton held up a copy of Yale law professor Stephen Carter's book on religion in America and said, "You people all there ought to buy this book and read it." Would that he would do that with one of my books. Would that the New York Times would offer me a page. Any author would love to have this treatment. And I mention this to indicate that the book was considered really of tremendous importance. It was something that the New York Times was very anxious for readers to see, to read, and to believe. And the book was nominated for a National Book Award and actually won it. It was considered to be tremendously important. Tremendously important about religion. Now, Mr. Weiner began his book and began his account about the book in the New York Times by saying that he was mystified, that everywhere he went, he seemed to run into people who were called creationists. And they believed in something called creation. And they didn't believe in something called evolution. As he presented it, all of these people were biblical fundamentalists, but they were people who had college degrees, who were professional people, who seemed successful in life. And he was mystified as to how they could possibly have doubts about what he called evolution, the theory of evolution. Now, the reason he was so mystified by this, and the point of the book, was that he had seen evolution actually occurring. He was in the position of the famous agnostic journalist H.L. Mencken, who, when asked whether he believed in infant baptism, said, "Believe it, I've seen it done." Now, Mr. Weiner had seen it done in the following sense. He had learned about a couple named Grant, a man and wife, a husband and wife scientific team from Princeton University, who spent several weeks every year, for quite a long period of time, I think over a couple of decades, going every year to an island called Daphne Island in the Galapagos chain off the coast of South America. And they're studying the flora and fauna, and especially the finches on that island. Now, you may know, if you know anything about the history of science, the history of biology, that Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos chain of islands during the voyage of the Beagle years before he published his masterpiece, The Origin of Species. And the variations from island to island of the beaks and tails of finches, as well as the shapes of the tortoises, have been a common illustration of effects of evolutionary variation ever since. Now, what was important about the work of the Grants on Daphne Island, according to Mr. Weiner and the enthusiastic reviewers, was that he was able to show that evolution was not just something that had worked in the past, which had left effects today so that you could observe the differences of the birds from one island to another, but the Grants had actually seen the process happen and thus had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the theory was true and that all those people who were skeptical about it back in the United States were essentially out of touch with reality. That was the message of the book. Now, here's what the Grants had actually seen. The most spectacular example of evolution that they had seen, as it was described in this book, was as follows. During the year 1977, on Daphne Island, there was a terrible drought. Most of the finches died because the plants died, and the seeds that they ate were unavailable. But those who survived bred the next generation, and it turned out that the finches that were left after the drought had beaks which were on an average 4 to 5% larger than before the drought. And their beaks were better shaped for opening the last tough seeds that remained on the island. Thus, in drought conditions, and with the last tough seeds left and larger ones, larger beaks were presumably an advantage in eating and therefore surviving and therefore reproducing. And so, for a time, the average beak size of the finch population went up by 4 to 5%. Now, you understand no finch's beak changed size because of this. This is simply an average in the population resulting from this advantage. Now, then in 1983, 6 years later, floods came. They apparently had a very severe climate on these islands, and by the way, no conveniences of plumbing or electricity or whatever, so the Grants live a pretty rough life, I guess, when they're visiting. The floods came, and the island turned immediately, almost overnight, from desert into jungle. The next generation of finches, after many had died again because they were drowned, had smaller beaks, which fitted them to enjoy the multitude of tiny seeds that became available. So beak size thus went through a cycle caused by environmental changes from small to large and then back to small. And I might add that this entire set of observations was reported in Nature, the scientific journal, with the title Oscillating Selection in Darwin's Finches. See, it's oscillating because it's going back and forth. Now, the interesting thing about this whole episode is, why is this so important? You say, well, why was the New York Times considering this to be one of the most important books of the year? Why did it win the National Book Award? Why was it considered to be such an important thing for people to read and understand? In all the times that I've talked about this book to lecture audiences or classes or whatever, I've never yet found anybody, even a single person, who regarded this observation as at all controversial. Undoubtedly, the Grants made their measurements carefully. Undoubtedly, the change in average beak size that they measured was accurately there. Undoubtedly, this is of interest if you're really into finches and into natural observations. But other than that, who cares? Why is the New York Literary, Cultural, and Political Society so determined to honor and emphasize the importance of a book like this? Well, the answer is perfectly clear. It isn't finch beaks that this subject is about; it's creation. And what it is hoped that one will believe is that since a process of evolution has been illustrated with this variation, that one will conclude that the same process, continued over a great period of time and a great many years, produced finches and tortoises and seeds and scientific observers and all of the other kinds of living things that exist by a similar process of random variation in the size of the beaks, and natural selection, the differential survival of those that were more fit to survive under these conditions. And in fact, you don't have to look very far. The rest of the book explains this agenda. And if you look at the literature of Darwinian evolutionary biology as a whole, you will see that the proposition which a simple, modest example like this is meant to illustrate is that science has been able to succeed in explaining how living things, which are exceedingly complex, contain many interrelated complex parts, which seem indeed more complicated than computers, airplanes, and other kinds of machines that are produced by human intelligence, that science has explained how these things could come into existence, and in fact did come into existence, by purely material forces, so that there is no need to imagine anything supernatural, there is no need to imagine a creator, there is no need to imagine a mind being involved in bringing forth these living things. And indeed, so that as the Darwinian theory is interpreted by its leading British spokesman, a man who has been much honored by the British scientific establishment for bringing the public to a proper understanding of science, Richard Dawkins explains that although biology is the study of complex things that look as if they were created for a purpose, in fact, if you understand the Darwinian mechanism, you will know that they were produced by purely unintelligent material processes of mutation and selection. And that in fact, in the way Dawkins interprets the Darwinian theory, all that plants and animals of any kind, including human beings, really are, is the effects of DNA reproducing itself and producing more DNA. Bodies exist because DNA found it convenient to have bodies to assure its own survival. But what is being reproduced through the generations is this a genetic material, this genetic substance, and it cares only for survival. Actually, it doesn't care for that either. It's the fact that it survives, the fact that it produces more copies of DNA is the only thing that keeps this process going. And so Dawkins concludes in a recent Scientific American article that the picture of the world that emerges from the study of Darwinian evolutionary biology is that we live in a world in which there is ultimately no purpose, no right or wrong, and no meaning. He concludes, DNA doesn't care about suffering because DNA doesn't care about anything, and we dance to its music. Now, notice how a really rather simple scientific observation has here been enveloped in an entire philosophical system which aims to explain the world in terms of completely mechanical, material, and purposeless forces. Now, many people might find that philosophy attractive or unattractive. They might find it appalling that there's no purpose to the universe. On the other hand, they might think that the absence of an ultimate purpose gives us freedom to select our own purposes in lives, and they might think that that's a good thing. But I think before we decide whether we like the philosophy or not, we might ask whether it's really true. That is, whether, in fact, a scientific understanding of reality that comes from observation shows us a living world which is solely the product of purposeless material forces, or whether it shows us something else indeed. Now, one of my colleagues and friends is about to publish a book which takes a very different view of what biology really tells us. This is Professor Michael Behe of Leahy University, a professor of molecular biology, whose book, Darwin's Black Box, is about to be published by Free Press. I think it's going to come out this summer. It's in the final publication stages at the moment. And I think it's going to create quite a controversy and make a splash in scientific circles. Because what Behe explains in this book is that modern molecular biology has come, as one might expect, to a much greater understanding of the complexity of living organisms than was present in Darwin's time, or even in the time of the zoologists and fossil experts who founded the modern version of the neo-Darwinian theory. In fact, this is why he titles his book Darwin's Black Box, because exactly how biological systems, how the organs of the body, vision, the immune system that fights off disease, the circulation of the blood, the operations of the cell, this very DNA protein synthesis and so on, are a dimension of biology that was only beginning to be understood even 30 years ago. And now a great deal is understood about it, and Behe goes through in chapter after chapter to show you how complex things are at the molecular level, and how difficult it is to understand these things merely in terms of purposeless material mechanisms, or to imagine they could have been created that way. For one of Behe's examples, he likes to take on Richard Dawkins and the orthodox Darwinian view. Dawkins begins his explanation of how the eye might have evolved by saying, imagine first a primitive light-sensing mechanism. You say, and you have that, and then he's going to think about how it could be expanded, and it could change in shape, and it could be better at resolving images, and so on. Behe says, I'm going to tell you what a primitive light-sensing mechanism really is. And he shows in enormous detail how, when you deal at the biochemical level with the proteins and protein mechanisms, with the chains of molecules that must engage in complicated chemical reactions, all of the reactions being necessary for the other reactions to occur, so that no one part of this system makes any sense or has any understandable function in the absence of the system as a whole, he says the mechanism of Darwin's black box has been filled in. You know what a black box is, in science. It's like something that produces, for most of us, the computer is a black box. We key in something and something comes out. We haven't any idea what's going on in the middle. And you can imagine anything, of course, if you don't know what the innards are and how they work. But if you learn in detail how this thing is put together and how it's run, then you understand all of the ingenuity and intelligence and complex planning that had to go into making it. And so Bayes is going to show that at the molecular level and make the argument very forthrightly that this Darwinian understanding of the mechanism of life, of the origin of the complex interrelated structures which are necessary to make any kind of living thing work, even including a relatively simple bacterial cell, that if that were understood completely, the Darwinian explanation never could have gotten off the ground. Shows, I think one of his most interesting points that he shows is that molecular biologists now do not even make any serious explanation to explain how these mechanisms could have occurred. There's an entire discipline of molecular evolution, and it has 2 journals devoted to molecular evolution. But what the journals show, what they are about, is molecular relationships. What the papers, almost without exception, show is that some things, that by comparing a certain kind of molecule that's present in one organism and another, you can show that some things seem to be, rabbits are more like horses than they are like snakes. They're still less like plants and so on, that you can draw these molecular relationships. But you don't see, what you do not see is serious, realistic efforts to explain how these very complex molecular systems could have come together step by step. And indeed, this work of Bayes fits in with other works that colleagues and mine are doing, which suggests that what you really have to understand about living systems in order to understand how they operate is that they contain not just chemicals and not just matter, but information, and very complex information. Now, oddly enough, this is a point which is conceded even by the orthodox Darwinian materialists with whom we're all in debate. Richard Dawkins, for example, concedes that even a simple bacterial cell contains more information, more instructions. You might consider this as analogous to the computer program, Windows 95 in your PC, than all of the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together. George C. Williams, who is one of Dawkins' colleagues, one of the leading Darwinian evolutionary biologists of today, concedes that information cannot be reduced to its material base. If you have that encyclopedia that we've just spoken of, you understand that the words, the writing, and the meaning of that encyclopedia can't be explained in terms of the chemical qualities of the ink and paper in which it's written. The information that conveys the meaning is something very different from the material medium in which it is inscribed. Now, it isn't possible in a lecture, it isn't possible in an evening or even in a week to resolve all of the debates which I think are going to be occurring about the nature of life and of evolutionary biology. But what I want to bring to your attention is that there is a developing intellectual movement which criticizes the strong materialism, the strong notion that purposeless material forces are all that was involved in the creation of life, in the creation of genetic information, in the development of life to its present complexity, on scientific grounds. And what remains to be seen, this, I think, is where the notion that much of what I'm saying is dangerous and too dangerous to be heard in a university environment with official sponsorship. What remains to be seen is whether or not it will prove acceptable to have this debate in the university world and in the scientific world, because many people in that world are very determined to say that the only possible understanding of reality is a scientific understanding which is based on materialist philosophy. That is, we must assume that life is matter and matter only, that material, unguided, purposeless forces produced all living things, because that's the way science is practiced. Those are the assumptions on which science is based, and therefore anything else is simply out of court for consideration at all. Our argument is that science is not a search for the most effective defense of materialist philosophy. It's a search for the truth about how things really are, including how living things really are. And if information which appears to be the product of mind and intelligence, is part of the nature of what life is, then that will have to be taken into account if science is to achieve a true understanding of life. Now, we might ask the same question after this description of Behe's book that I asked about the beak of the finch. Who cares? If you're a molecular biologist, I suppose you might care. If you're a philosopher, you might care. If you're an intellectual who worries about these intellectual problems, you might care. But it's much more than that. If you're a parent, if you're a citizen, if you're interested in the problems of life at all, this kind of debate turns out to be very, very important. Because one of the fundamental questions of life is whether we are to understand our existence, our life, as having the meaning that it can have if it is the product of a purposeful entity, if we are the product of a purposeful creator who brought our lives into existence in order that they could have meaning, or if we are, on the other hand, the products of a completely meaningless material system. To show you how profoundly assumptions about that nature of the life processes, nature of what science has or has not shown us, affects the understanding of issues that seem very far removed from biology. Let me tell you about a couple of important philosophers of our time. Richard Rorty of the University of Virginia is one of the most influential of contemporary philosophical authorities, and a person who is often considered one of the major founders of postmodernism and relativist thinking in the universities. Rorty wrote in a recent article that the great problem that philosophers have faced ever since Darwin's time is the need to combine their obligation to keep faith with Darwin. That's the word he uses, keep faith with Darwin, which he means keep faith with the accepted scientific understanding of the world, and to preserve as much of common sense as they can. For example, he says, most religious points of view cannot be reconciled with a Darwinian, which is to say a strictly materialistic understanding of the world. Neither can the idea that human beings have a conscience, which is to say a built-in understanding of the difference between right and wrong, which only an evil choice can ignore. He says that's a common sense notion that most people have, that we have a conscience, that there is a right and wrong which our conscience perceives, and that this right and wrong is not something that we've made up ourselves. He says this is not a Darwinian idea, that there is some right and wrong built into the world. All that the Darwinian understanding of reality knows is survival and the needs of the organism to survive. Another idea, he says, that is hard to maintain in a Darwinian or materialistic world is the notion that observation, experiment, and clear, precise logical thinking can lead us to a true and objective account of reality. He says this notion, too, is hard to reconcile with the Darwinian understanding of life. The idea that one species of organism is, unlike all the others, oriented not just towards its own increased prosperity, but towards truth with a capital T, is as un-Darwinian as the idea that every human being has a built-in moral compass. That is, a sense that points to some objective idea of right or wrong outside of ourselves. Why? Well, consider what the mind is in a Darwinian understanding. Well, how did the mind evolve? The only things that natural selection encouraged were things which led to increased success in survival and reproduction. Just like those finches on Daphne Island. The reason you had large finch beaks is that for a time they were better able to open those seeds, and it just happened that way. The qualities that would be encouraged are just qualities that produce a greater success in reproduction, and therefore, he says, the idea that one species of organism is oriented towards objective truth is inherently un-Darwinian. Now, here is one example of how a philosopher, not involved in any regime near biology, takes unquestionably what is thought to be the understanding that biology is giving us of the meaning of life as a whole and applies it to these philosophical questions. And one finds this again and again, that this kind of assumption dominates philosophy. The philosophers feel they must start with the orthodox scientific, which is a materialistic understanding of reality. Now let me give you a second example. This is from the famous author Aldous Huxley, who many of you will have encountered as the author of Brave New World. And Huxley is a man with a lineage famous in the whole Darwinian history. His grandfather was Thomas Henry Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog and was Charles Darwin's great advocate in the early days of the theory. Aldous Huxley's brother, another grandson of Thomas Henry Huxley, was Julian Huxley, a biologist who was one of the founders of the modern version of the Darwinian theory. So you might say he's a member of the royal family of the theory, and a famous thinker and author in his own right, novelist and a philosophical thinker. He was also what you might call something of a 60s student ahead of his time. He was a 60s student in the 20s. He belonged to the British aristocracy, and they were ahead of, people in adopting some of the ways that came to Berkeley in the late 1960s. And he was something of a flower child, a drug experimenter, and a moral experimenter, as he'll tell you. Now, here's how he explains his own attraction to the philosophical idea of the world that came from scientific materialism and Darwinism. Aldous Huxley writes, "Like so many of my contemporaries, I took for granted that there was no meaning to the world. This was partly due to the fact that I shared the common belief that the scientific picture of an abstraction from reality was a true picture of reality as a whole." You see what he's saying? It's partly because he understood this Darwinian scientific picture as a true picture of reality as a whole. So the world had no meaning, no inherent purpose. I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning. Consequently, I assumed it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. For myself, as no doubt for most of my contemporaries, this philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation. The liberation we desired was simultaneously liberation from a certain political and economic system. You'll recall he grew up in the England of the 1920s when there was still a very conservative social hierarchy. And we also desired a liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. We objected to the political and economic system because it was unjust. The supporters of these systems claimed that they embodied the meaning, a Christian meaning, they insisted, of the world. There was one admirably simple method of confuting these people and at the same time justifying ourselves in our political and sexual revolt. We could deny that the world had any meaning whatsoever. Now, these examples illustrate that an understanding of reality that says that it has been established and we now must take for granted that we live in a world of purposeless, meaningless material causes and that that's all there is, leads to an understanding of that mind of God that Stephen Hawking was pointing towards as saying that God has no mind, that there is no God, that there is only this material and purposeless world. And if that is the case, then as Richard Rorty and other philosophers have concluded, in fact, there is no enduring and firm basis for not only an understanding of purpose in our lives, but for an understanding of the difference between right and wrong, of an understanding of some things being inherently more beautiful than others, even an understanding of an objective truth to which we can aspire by reason. Now, it isn't surprising that given the importance of all of these issues, that there is a disposition in intellectual life to challenge some of this materialist understanding. There's also a disposition in political life I note that the state of Alabama just last month passed a resolution which says that in every high school biology textbook sold in the state, a warning notice has to be put. That the evolutionary principles advanced in this textbook carry philosophical implications that may go way beyond biology, and that the reasons for doubting the truth of some of these things is not fully developed in the books, and people should be careful to keep an open mind. This has been much caricatured, this state policy, but it indicates, I think, something that is going to be a continuing problem, and is in fact a continuing problem as ordinary people interact with the intellectual community and what the intellectual community wants taught in the textbooks. If it is in fact the case that science has or proved this materialistic understanding of reality, then I suppose we have to live with it. But a great many of us are not convinced that that is true at all. What we are convinced of is that what we have seen is a particular philosophical agenda that certain people wanted to believe in for powerful reasons having to do with questions that went way beyond the kinds of things that you can learn by measuring finch beaks, and have used a scientific understanding to promote this philosophical a system of materialism. Now, behind these questions, there is ultimately the question of what rationality is. Because that's what a university is fundamentally dedicated to, is a rational understanding of the world. According to one point of view, a rational understanding of the world must be a materialist understanding because it's only matter that we can measure. It's only matter that we can see. And so the goal of explaining the whole world, that goal that Stephen Hawking stated so romantically, has to be followed by strictly materialist means. And yet what we discover at the end of that road is that the effort to understand things solely in terms of those material questions leads to a meaningless, purposeless system in which even the mind and its quest for objective truth comes into question as just simply the product of material forces like natural selection, and hence not reliable as a guide to truth. What, in fact, I think a rational university and a rational world needs to find is an adequate basis for a faith that we can understand the world rationally. The adequate understanding that we need, as all of our best thinkers have somehow ultimately realized, is an understanding not just of the mechanisms by which things work, although the understanding of mechanism is a praiseworthy and legitimate activity, but an understanding of the meaning behind the mechanisms, an understanding of how it is possible that we have been gifted with minds and consciousness that can seek absolute truth and that have an urge to seek meaning. A system which explains how it is possible that we can have an instinctive understanding that there is a fundamental difference between right and wrong, an understanding which we cannot do without, even when people say that this is simply an illusion caused by this material process of evolution. In short, we need a rationality of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And this rationality, I believe, will be found only in the basis of understanding that there is a creator, there is a purpose, there is a rationality behind the universe as a whole. A rational understanding of life does not come from an assumption that the cosmos begins in the mindless motion of material particles. It comes from an understanding that the cosmos and the life within it begins with a mind. Properly understood, evidence evaluated without bias, I think, will in the end establish that this is the case. But we don't need to look to the end. We don't need to predict the end. What we need to do for now is to open up the university and its dialogue to the thought that an objective truth founded in the reality of a creator who created truth-seeking minds is the true basis for conducting this search for truth, and can establish its own way on its own merits if granted the right to free inquiry and debate in the university. Well, that's my remarks for tonight, and now we'll have a word from our sponsor, I think, and then we can get to the question period. Particularly grateful for the person who asked the first question and get things started. The purpose of the lecture is to set up the question period, so yes. Go to it.
Professor Johnson, hasn't the theory of evolution gone through an evolutionary process in itself? I mean, as far as from Darwin coming up with his theory up to present day?
Has the evolutionary theory gone through evolution itself and changed? Well, not really in essentials. I mean, that is, of course, there's been a lot of development in details and ways. Now, but it's amazing how much the original theory, the issues which were controversial at the time of the original theory, are still the issues that are controversial today. One of the issues, for example, is that Darwin placed so much emphasis on domestic animal breeding as an illustration of how evolution could occur. Yet domestic animal breeding is a purposeful process that human beings carry on for a goal, protecting the products of that from the nature that would kill them off as over-specialized creatures. And it produces results only within the species. That's one of the controversies that people are still noticing, is to what extent you can extrapolate. Thomas Henry Huxley himself, Darwin's first disciple, said that he wouldn't believe in the theory until there had been clear-cut examples of producing new species by breeding. And it actually hasn't been produced yet. Although I don't want to give too much emphasis to that, because a species is only a separated breeding group, the way biologists defend it. What needs to be produced, what the system has to produce, is new complex organs, an organ system, brains and hearts and so on, not just groups which can't interbreed with each other. The fossil record was an issue from the very first. And Huxley again said that he thought that Darwin made a mistake not to allow for evolution by jumps or saltations. And this is an issue that rears its head every so often. Well, can't we understand evolution as something that happens suddenly? And this has become much more important in recent years because it's come to the fore again. This has always been a problem, but it was submerged for years. But the work of Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldridge, David Raup, Stephen Stanley, and other fossil experts has brought forward to public consciousness again that the general pattern of fossil history is that things just stay the same. New things appear in rocks dated in different ages, but when they appear suddenly and fully formed, and they stay the same thereafter. Now, this is very hard to reconcile with the Darwinian picture of a process of continual gradual change that is making these new organs out of nothing. Now, in point of fact, the evolution that the paleontologists are studying is mostly after all those things are already in existence. Because, as it happens, all the major animal groups appear in the rocks of the Cambrian period without any traceable evolutionary history at all. So, at any event, there's this problem of how you reconcile the fossil record with the Darwinian theory has been around a long time. I think what's new is this problem of complexity and information. The Darwinian assumption has been all along that the problem is just explaining variation. You see, and if you can get a little bit of variation, like in those finches on the island, you can imagine you can have a lot of variation over a long period of time, and so things can differentiate, and you can get all sorts of different kinds of things. Well, that isn't really the way, I think, to understand what the problem is. The problem is how you get these very complicated things. Richard Dawkins has tried to address that in the Blind Watchmaker, which is, as I say once again, remarkably similar in its essentials to the original Darwinian theory. So while it's been, back and forth and saying, the change hasn't been basic. Now, there's a reason why it can't be basic. I guess I want to conclude my answer to this with saying that this is not accidental. And the reason is this, why the theory has not been able to change in any basic way. In every generation, there have been scientists who said this can't work, it's at conflict with the evidence, we've got to have a new theory. As recently as 1980, Stephen Jay Gould, the most prominent American evolutionary theorist, said that neo-Darwinism is effectively dead as a general theory. But the problem is that a theory of evolution, to do the job it's supposed to do, has to provide a materialist understanding of biological complexity. It's not enough to say that new things appear. It's not enough to say, well, one thing after another, and things are around, they stay the same for a while, and then something new appears. What you need to explain to have a scientifically adequate theory is how all of this interrelated complexity occurs. And all of the biologists that have faced on that problem have come to the conclusion it has to appear tiny bit by tiny bit. Why? Because large-scale changes in functioning organisms, whenever they're observed, are nearly always fatal or very harmful. For the same reason that, hitting your watch with a hammer doesn't tend to produce an improved watch. What is hoped for, what the theory understands, so what is assumed, is that tiny chance changes in an organism could on occasion be beneficial, and then those accumulated by natural selection could build tiny step by tiny step, this complexity. When Darwinism is understood in that complexity building mode, that it's the answer to the complexity problem, it's inherently a gradualist system. If you get eyes and hearts emerging all at once in a single generation, that's a miracle. You see, that's not scientific. So the problem of explaining the complexity leads the theory to stick to these mechanisms of very small random changes that are accumulated by natural selection. Many scientists who work in the field like to get away with that. Some of the paleontologists, fossil experts I've mentioned, don't even like to talk about natural selection. They like to talk about new things appearing suddenly, because that's what they're seeing in the fossils. But you see, that they can't. That doesn't fill the need that the theory has to fill. Yes,
Professor Johnson, I feel that it's kind of ridiculous to stand here talking about meaning and truth when in our society it seems apparent that there already is meaning. And the first person I ever came upon using truth to define meaning was. And this might seem odd or an oxymoron, but it was Nietzsche. Whether you agree or disagree with his ideology or philosophy. And then, more importantly, I feel that today we have two formal philosophers that are using knowledge and truth and applying it to our generation. And I would think those two men are Noam Chomsky out of MIT and John Rawls out of Harvard, who both written, Chomsky's a linguist and Rawls is a philosopher. And Rawls particularly uses knowledge and truth and applies it as meaning for our society in the attempts to better order society in general. And I think that is the meaning, and I think that we have overlooked that. And Noam Chomsky also uses that same formula to define meaning, and I actually think that we have meaning. Am I wrong to think that there is meaning? Or
let me deal with that. Obviously, there are a lot of philosophers around with a lot of different opinions, and indeed, one that you mentioned, John Rawls, the Harvard liberal philosopher, is largely concerned with finding out how we can have principles of justice that we can all agree on, when in fact they can't come from outside. And that's why Rawls's famous book talks about how people could, if they didn't understand the particular situation in life they could have, how they could agree on principles of justice. It's an attempt to build meaning out of a foundation in no meaning, to build meaning out of a hypothetical human agreement that he thinks could occur under very, special conditions in which we were all denied any memory or knowledge of our particular circumstances in life. Now, what this kind of effort illustrates, I think, is exactly what Richard Rorty is talking about, is that the effort of philosophers is to try to avoid the slide towards nihilism, the slide towards the notion that everybody's opinion is as good as everybody else's, that there are no objective principles that people can agree on, that it's just what works for you. That tends inevitably to be suggested by this materialist understanding of reality. Now, I think it is. I mean, I don't want to trifle with this question because, as I say, there are probably a lot of philosophers who will say, well, we can solve this problem. And say we can start with this materialist understanding, and we can somehow, by one philosophical move or another, create a meaning for our lives, or a way in which we can think we have meaning, or something like that. And each one of them has a different system. Now, what my concern is to liberate people from the notion that they have to assume that this materialist understanding of reality is actually true. You see, I don't think it is true. I don't think we have to face that problem. I think that in fact, the meaning and purpose of the overall world that we live in and of our lives comes from the Creator, and that there is nothing in the scientific evidence which in any way tends to discredit that when it's considered without bias. So that's what I want to liberate people from, is the notion that they have to face that problem. There are some worthy and well-meaning people who are doing their best to face the problem, but I don't think that they need to face it. Thanks for the question, though. Yes.
I was wondering if you had by any chance read Michael Crichton's new book, The Lost World.
No, I haven't. I read some of his earlier books.
Right. He was the same one who wrote Jurassic Park and all that.
Yeah.
In it, he proposes a sort of a new twist on the theory of evolution, that since it's now come to the point that simple mutations in DNA cannot seem to explain how complex structures have evolved over time, he suggests that chaos theory itself might be brought in to explain how somehow, using the mathematics of order out of disorder and vice versa, that these kind of structures would evolve out of the interaction of many complex parts of a system somehow coming together.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that theory, if you had heard of it.
Oh, yes. I've heard a great deal of it. And what it illustrates is, I think, in the first place, is I believe your statement of the question implied, that a great many people feel that given the this incredible interrelated complexity of living things, that this idea that random chance changes that can't be observed were accumulated by selection, and produced it all over a period of time, isn't a very satisfactory system. And as I've said, for throughout the whole Darwinian period, from the beginning to now, there have always been people who've said that, and we're going to produce something else. And one of the things that is much in the news these days is the notion that there are principles of self-ordering in complex systems. That there are physical laws which generate this great complexity, which can be studied. And this, perfectly, if people want to study this and find the laws or whatever, they're entitled to. I was at a scientific convention this past summer in Madrid, in Spain, and one of the co-participants there was a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist named Christian de Duve, who's written a book called Vital Dust, some of you might have seen. And de Duve's view is that there must be laws of chemistry and physics that produce complexity, that produce living systems out of non-living systems, and that will produce intelligent life out of, simpler life forms. That there must be these laws, and the reason there must be these laws is it couldn't possibly have happened by chance. You see, and there must be laws. The problem is that you then got another set of biologists who say, chance must be able to do this. Gould is a big fan of chance because there aren't any such laws, you see, in biology. So there's no agreement on exactly what they are, or on whether the kinds of things that actually can come out of chemical systems, interesting patterns and so on, really have anything to do with biology. Now, I don't want to take any ultimate position on this. I mean, if people can discover laws of complexity and so on, let them do it. But it's very important not to mistake speculative statements about what we hope to show one day, for demonstrated realities. And moreover, by the way, it's entirely possible that a creator brought about creation might have and made use of law-like processes which are amenable to study. So I have no hostility to that as ideas, but don't think that what has been done here is to show that we can get along without the Darwinian system and prove, and account for the existence of all of these complex things by material mechanisms without any need for a mind or whatever, because it's not at that level. It's interesting ideas that are worth exploring, and let them be explored. Yes.
I've enjoyed your talk. during the first question you said that eyes and noses all at once, that's just not scientific. But isn't that in essence what creationism is? And if you're agreeing with that, why don't you write a book debunking creationism? And if you're going to go even further, what should we teach other than evolutionism? Do we want to teach the 7-day theory?
Well, look, the question is whether the nature of life is such that there is a plausible way in which we can describe all of these things as being brought about by unintelligent material mechanisms. Now, what the people that I work with, what the group that I work with is really convinced of, is that in fact life contains the signs of intelligence in the form of irreducible information, like that complex computer program in your Windows 95, and that material processes are simply not adequate. Now, what that tends to indicate, if it's true, if that position holds water, is that an intelligence was necessary or was involved. We can infer the existence of intelligence from the products of intelligence, and that's just the way it looks like things are. Now, we don't know. We don't claim to know, and I think it's very premature even to ask how that intelligence worked. Did it work by a gradual process that's amenable to scientific study or whatever? Well, that's the kind of thing that's well worth consideration in the scientific world. There's no intent here to shut out scientific investigation. But what isn't scientific is to assume that things are different from the way they are so that you can find the kind of solution that you want. That is, if life contains information, complex, interrelated systems, then this truth has to be faced to get a scientific understanding. And as far as what we should teach what we know, and we should teach what we don't know. It's perfectly proper for zoologists to teach that you can get variations in finch beaks in years of drought as opposed to years of floods. But to say that what has been demonstrated there is a process that can bring complex organs into being is to go way beyond the evidence, and that should be taught critically too. There's no need to do anything fantastic here. It's just a question of teaching what we know, teaching what we don't know, and making sure we understand the difference.
Do you believe in the Bible being the correct representation of creationism?
I think that the Bible actually does come from God as a source of the proper understanding of what life is really about and what the point of the history of life has really been. I am very open-minded in how to understand the particular descriptive parts of that, however. And part of the reason is I don't want to go beyond what I know. I want to do exactly what I said in response to that last question. Let's talk about what we know. Let's admit what we don't know. Let's sort of be flexible in between. To me, the starting point for understanding the Bible, for understanding the Creator or whatever, is to start with the most basic point and work from there. I'm dealing with a scientific world that says you don't need a creator, materialist systems can do it. The question I want to ask is, do you need a creator? And did a creator have to be involved? Beyond that, there's a whole lot more to learn that I don't claim to know.
Well, I just was wondering how the Bible, there's so much difference at the starting point of human intelligence. As the Bible created man fully intelligent, and we know, by getting paleontologists, we can show that there was life before human beings. Well,
I don't question, in fact, although there's a great deal that I don't know about it. I don't question the antiquity of life forms on Earth or bring that into it. But one of the things you have to understand is that, like other people, I don't know the answers to a whole lot of questions. And as I say, what I'm trying to do in my own speaking and writing is what I advised the young gentleman of the question before, is talk about what I know and acknowledge what I don't know. Now, what to me the important starting point is it prevents you from getting anywhere if you try to answer all the questions at once. My own opinion is that if it is recognized that life contains the kind of irreducible information and complexity that it seems to do, that there's going to be a revolution in scientific understanding because so much has been built on the contrary premise, and we don't know how far that it's going to go. And at the end of that process, it'll be much more ripe time to ask questions about how to compare the scientific understanding with the biblical account. So I really don't try to go very far into that. In fact, I'm very anxious to put the biblical account aside, because the problem is, see, that as soon as that kind of question gets in there, I've lost the attention of the scientific community on a question of scientific evidence. All they're going to want to talk about is Noah's Ark, and why they don't believe that, or or whatever. And that, it seems to me, is not a useful way to proceed. The proper question for now is, what do we know about the nature of life and the life processes? So I try to stick to that. Yes.
More a comment than a question. I happened to catch Stephen Gould on a talk show, a late-night talk show on the radio called the Jim Bohannon Show, I think. And he just happened to address one of the questions that you had raised about the abilities of the mind being explained by a materialist evolutionary theory. If I understand correctly what he said that the developed human mind has been around for such a short period of time on the evolutionary scale of time that it actually hasn't affected evolution at all, that the entire development of the mind has been pointless as far as evolution is concerned. I believe that's my understanding of what he said.
Well, that's a funny way to answer the question. You see, that's not the issue. That's not what we want to know. What we want to know is, how does this thing come into existence? How does consciousness, how does the ability to choose, the ability to pursue the truth, like the truth about evolution, if you like, how does this come into existence? There's never been an adequate Darwinian explanation for the mind. Historically, this was the issue over which the two co-discoverers of the natural selection theory, or co-inventors, whatever you want to call them, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, split. Because Wallace said, you cannot explain the human mind in terms of natural selection. Natural selection rewards only success in reproduction under the conditions in which it exists. But he said, if you look at the minds of even the most primitive savages, you got to remember, this is in imperialist days before people were sensitive to this sort of thing. So he's talking about the primitive savages in the jungles and so on. He'd say, in fact, it's a very non-racist statement that he was making. They have all of the inherent mental equipment of the civilized person in the universities of Europe. It just hasn't been developed, it hasn't been educated, and so on. He says they just have much too much inherent mental equipment to be of any use to them under primitive conditions. You see, so natural selection doesn't really explain it. Well, there's a Darwinian answer to that, like there is to everything. And the answer is, there was a mutation that did have some survival value to make you better able to survive than the neighboring ape or whatever. But it just happened to come along in a big burst with lots of extra neurons, you see. So there was this serendipitous extra effect. Well, I don't regard that as an explanation. I mean, that's a story, but it's not really an explanation. And so what Gould is doing is he's just sidestepping the whole question with that. The mind, it hasn't been around long. It hasn't affected the course of evolution. That's not what we want to know. But in fact, that's one of the fascinating things about Gould. Gould says there's been no progress in the history of life. Bacteria were there at the beginning, and bacteria are still the most successful things. Well, then why did things get more complicated, like complex plants and animals and human beings? Well, they couldn't get simpler because they started out simple. So the variation was in the direction of getting more complicated. He really says things like that. Now, I don't want to pick on the guy too much because he's a great essayist, and I think he said an awful lot of things that are true. And I think the fact of the matter is that what Steve Gould is doing is describing what he sees, which is just this mysterious appearance of things, because that's what that's what a fossil viewer tends to see. And it isn't a Darwinian picture, but he can't say that. He can't say we don't have a mechanism because, you see, then that lets the enemy in. People like me. The dangerous people, who will say, you've been claiming to have this materialist explanation and you don't. I might add on this that the orthodox neo-Darwinian camp, the Richard Dawkins, John Maynard Williams, Daniel Dennett, the other authors who write from this very strong its mutation and selection viewpoint, are completely fed up with Gould. And in the recent issue of the New York Review of Books, John Maynard Smith, who's England's sort of grand old man of Darwinism, Dawkins is his protege, said, while Gould is very popular with the public because his essays are so readable, says most evolutionary biologists that I know say that his ideas are too confused to be worth serious thought. Yeah, and Maynard Smith is a very courtly kind of guy, and this is awfully strong language to him to use. They're really fed up with the guy. And this is America's leading evolutionary authority. There's tremendous confusion in the ranks, you see, because what they really see, and particularly in the fossils, what we're seeing in this information there inside just doesn't fit the Darwinian picture. But the Darwinian picture is so important philosophically. It's so important as part of the ideology of the society and, of course, of science that it's got to be protected. And I think that's what's going on there. Yes.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Daniel Jack. I'm a student at the University of Florida in the College of Human Health and Performance. My question is...
Glad to meet you.
How you doing? Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
My question is, assuming that there are two different worlds, a physical world and a spiritual world, and that in the physical world it would just be a perpetual learning of that world, that we would never really, there would always be something else to learn. And I'm also assuming that you had a revelation that there is an intelligent creator behind all of this, and assuming that, does that also incline that we can have a personal relationship with the creator?
Well, I'll answer the question as you finish it there. I don't, by the way, tend to think of a spiritual world and a physical world as being these very different things. That's a sort of a Neoplatonic idea or whatever, and it isn't really the way I think of reality. What I think of is, you see, the information embodied in matter, the intelligence of the Creator is embodied right in the material mechanism. They're inseparable. The matter is important. If you get a brain injury, your thinking is affected, But on the other hand, that material is in the brain isn't the whole mind. That's sort of the way I think about it. But I want to go on, to answer the last part of your question, because that's a really important. I think that big question of can we have a personal relationship with the Creator is of enormous importance. And this is where I think Christianity really differs from other theistic understandings of reality. Most of what I talk about in these lectures really has to do with what you might call generic theism. There's a mind behind it, and that's consistent with science and so on. But I'm not really going further than that. Now, I am myself, a Christian. But that doesn't come out of any study of biology or whatever. That comes out of an entirely different source, an entirely different experience, which is my understanding of, in part, the entire biblical plan of salvation and explanation of the meaning of the world and the personality of Jesus Christ as one encounters it in the gospel and in life. When you find that this is something you can really put your trust in and that can connect you to that meaning in the world and provide that meaning for even the kind of suffering that somebody like Stephen Hawking has undergone, as so many people have found out. And that, to me, is very much the case, that you can have that personal relationship. But I want to, as I say, that doesn't come from this intellectual endeavor of evaluating science or whatever, the philosophy. All that gets you really to is to understand that there's no obstacle to that. Reality, as it's understood even by science, is creation friendly. It's full of signs of the Creator. When you see evidence of the Creator elsewhere, where the Creator really meets you as in your own life, there's nothing in science to discourage you from accepting the invitation.
Well, after saying that, do you believe, will there ever be an scientific event that might stop us to start thinking that there is a intelligent Creator?
Oh, you mean, could the direction of science change or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's very possible. In fact, I expect it. This scientific materialist understanding hasn't been the orthodoxy in science or the universities forever. It's something that came about in the late 19th century, as part of a great cultural revolution there. And the 20th century, and people, the 20th century was the century of scientific materialism. It's the century of Darwin, Marx, and Freud. And I regard this as an aberrational period in human history. I think that the long-term trend of knowledge will be to have a view of rationality, like I indicated at the end of the lecture, that rationality comes from the Creator who endows our minds with reason and gives us a reason that extends to questions of meaning, beauty, morality, as well as material cause. So yes, I think there may well be a change. Now, that isn't going to usher in the kingdom of heaven. You know, back in the days when there was a different understanding of science, there were wars and evil and so on. There'll be spiritual problems, but I suspect that the intellectual world will not be so committed to a materialist and agnostic understanding as it is today.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, which are all of them, by the way, absolutely right down the pike. Excellent, and I appreciate them very much. See, now, let's hear the next one. This is about to be good now. You've got a tradition,
Good. I hope it's good. I don't think I can express it as eloquently as you did, but obviously you're here to try to spearhead this new approach to the scientific community in relationship to truth. I felt that a few times you touched on it, I would like you to try to expand it, and that was that I felt that the Achilles heel to their approach, the materialistic people, is the fact that they try to ascribe philosophical points from other philosophies other than pure materialism to give some order to the fact that, you know, human society has to function above, you know, just pure animalism, where is survival of the fittest. So therefore, although they claim to be materialistics and who are going to explain the truth just on materialism, they like to pull in, as here everybody would tend to call it, Judeo-Christian values of, although I think it goes much beyond that, but Judeo-Christian ethics of, you know, like that there is a God and that we're responsible to that supreme being.
I think what you're saying is excellent. It's actually a very well-phrased question, and it's very much down the line of what I'm concerned with. In fact, we see all the time that people who are from the scientific materialist world will flinch at the full implication of all that they're saying. And there's a lot to flinch at. You know, there's a famous biochemist at Stanford University named Arthur Kornberg who gave a lecture at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he said in that lecture that he was astonished that there were otherwise intelligent people, even medical doctors, who did not understand that the mind as part of life was chemistry and only chemistry. Only chemistry. So I wrote to him, and when I said, Dr. Kornberg, I realize you're having difficulty with this, that I can set you straight. The reason why those physicians and otherwise intelligent people don't know the mind is only chemistry is they have certain chemicals in their brain which cause them to have that belief. Whereas you have chemicals in your brain which cause you to believe that the mind is only chemistry. Now, you see, of course, what this little joke illustrates is that he was making an exception for his own mind. His mind isn't only chemistry. It's a straight-thinking thing that arrives at objective truth. Now, Richard Dawkins, who I quoted as saying, you know, that DNA is the master of everything. Our bodies are just DNA trying to produce more DNA. DNA doesn't care about anything, and we dance to its music. Well, people accused him of being, this being a reactionary philosophy that's against social progress and ameliorating evils and everything's determined. And he said, oh, no, not at all. I'm just warning you to watch out for that DNA. We can rebel against our DNA. We can choose not to follow our DNA's dictates, you see, and declare our independence. Well, this DNA seems to have made a big mistake here. It's created slaves who can rebel. Now, this kind of thing happens all the time. And I think it's connected to what Richard Rorty had in mind when he said what the philosophers are trying to do is to reconcile as much of common sense as they can, you see, while keeping faith with Darwin. This materialistic system ends in madness. I mean, who can possibly believe that this product of random mutation that is rewarding only success in reproduction produced the mind of Mozart? What kind of an explanation is that? It's trash. The theory's valid. It's not that Darwinism isn't true. It's very good for finch beaks. variation. At a certain level of micro variation, it's perfectly adequate scientific interpretation of what's going on. Expanded into this all-purpose philosophy of creation, and nobody can follow it to the limit. And so I think they then try to escape. And what they try to do is to bring in some kind of old-fashioned moral principles and whatever by the back door. That's to their credit. And so I'd rather have that than a lot of fanatics who go to the end with their philosophy. But it's an indication there's something inadequate in the philosophy. Yes, next one, please.
Hi, my name is Tim Brown, first semester student here at the University of Florida. And I know we made number 2 last year, but hey, there's always next year. Yeah.
Well, you're ahead of Berkeley, I'll tell you that.
Okay. Could you address what kind of legal political systems can evolve from the Darwinian materialism, relativism that you've talked about, and specifically in America? And related to that, do political systems evolve?
Oh, yes, they do. Hopefully not unguided by intelligence, but often very mindlessly. The question about the legal system is something that naturally I've given a lot of thought to. And Chapter 7 of my second book, Reason and the Balance, is specifically about that. The guiding light, the most famous and influential legal scholar in American history was the Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., longstanding Supreme Court justice. And when I teach legal theory, legal philosophy to law students, I use Holmes's essay, The Path of the Law, as the most important text in the course. It's sort of, we build the course around. And it's Darwinism applied to the law. What Holmes says is because we live in this materialist Darwinian universe, we have to put aside the idea that law can rest on morality, because that's unrealistic. Why? Well, you see, Richard Rorty told us why. The other Darwinian authorities told us why. In a Darwinian system, morality is created by human law. That's where it comes from. It's the only place it could. It's the rules of a particular society. So to say that they rest on some universal or underlying morality is to rest them on an illusion. And so what he said, we have to have a scientific system of law in which we understand that the purpose of law is independent of any morals because it is a system of threats and promises addressed to the public to get them to do what the rulers want in the interests of the prosperity, safety of the community as a whole. The bad man obeys law for the same reason as the good man. He doesn't want to go to jail or pay damages or whatever. It's a system of force and threats which is designed to affect and alter behavior. And there's no underlying moral structure to it. Now, we can see this in a great many legal issues that come up in our society, is this sense that morality is up for grabs, and why shouldn't everybody do what they want as long as they don't violate the rights of other people? You see, in a materialist system, what we have instead of moral principles are rights that individuals have and utility, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. And so this means that certain things that become open for change at any moment. One of the things that is being much addressed these days, and which I think we're going to see fundamental change, is marriage. One state Supreme Court is probably going to hold that restricting marriage to people of opposite sexes is unconstitutional. They say it violates the rights of people to marry whoever they want. To say that they have to marry somebody of the opposite sex. So what happens is that an institution like marriage that had been understood for a great deal of time as something which was instituted by God, which was part of the fundamental morality of the community, and just was a certain kind of thing, now becomes completely flexible and it can be changed insofar as people want it to be changed. So we naturally go to a relativistic understanding of law and legal obligation, and to a sense that the only reason to obey the law is that you might get caught. You see, and I think we see a lot of the consequences of that around us. See, which side was I at? Which is the next one? Here, over here. I lost. I forgot where I was.
Professor Johnson, my name is Partha Roy. I'm a zoology major here at the university. My question is, how does the philosophical extrapolation of evolution discredit the natural, biological aspect of evolution? Do you believe that each theory is separately flawed or discreditable, or does it follow from the philosophical
Well,
evolution of...
evolution means a lot of things. And, certainly there have been some processes of change or whatever. Life seems to have some kind of connectedness. Certainly within certain boundaries, there's been a vast amount of change and diversification in life forms. In that sense, I believe in evolution. It's a question of how much of it. But to me, the crucial question that comes under the heading of evolution is not whether and to what extent there's been change and diversification, but how did you get the complexity built up in the first place? What's the mechanism for doing all of that? And what I think that's the issue that I think has been hidden. It's a great unsolved problem that has been solved, there's been a pseudo solution to it by extrapolation from these very limited examples of change. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you then. I wasn't sure I got it right, but I did my best. Yeah.
Hi. Some people generally believe that either people polarize to one side of the issue, either they're completely creationalists or evolutionists and stuff like that. And it seems that the people usually believe that these two issues are opposite and opposing beliefs. But I have talked to some people around my friends and everything that have incorporated both into their lives and stuff. They believe in parts of both. And my question to you is, why do people usually see that these as opposing issues, and why can't the two issues coexist?
Well, the two issues being evolution and creation, I think in a large extent it depends what you mean by evolution. There's within, as I say, I've never met anybody, including the most inflexible fundamentalist, who doubted that those finch beaks varied, on that island. There's no question but that any kind of a creationist picture of life can allow for a great deal of change and variation and diversification within types and so on. So I'm very much open-minded to all of that question. Maybe I'd be one of those then, you see, in which a lot of different possibilities are compatible. What makes for a complete conflict, what makes for an irreconcilable conflict, is the materialist philosophy that has so heavily influenced the farther, the more ambitious claims of Darwinian evolution. It's the claim that it's an unguided, purposeless process, that it's just matter combining and changing on its own, and that no mind is necessary or involved in its direction or in the input into it. See, now that's not theistic in my mind in any realistic sense. So if you say, well, I believe in God and evolution, but evolution is an unguided material process in which God played no part, then it sounds to me you're just confused. You say, if you believe that God, while creating, also created laws and a certain diversification occurred in the course of that, all that can be perfectly consistent. So it really depends what you mean by evolution. Next.
Hello, I'm Charles.
Hi, Charles.
2 comments and a question. The first comment is, I can't understand quite why you were boggled about the evolution of Mozart.
Why I was what?
Boggled by how a prodigy like Mozart, could be explained by something like evolution.
By natural selection.
Yeah. I think you're confusing biological evolution with social evolution. Once human-like creatures decided that society was a better way to go than living on their own, better for fending off predators, better for gathering food, etc. After that, it was sort of a social evolution from which psychology can explain why Mozart...
Well, you have to have the inherent capacities there in the brain and in the mind for that social evolution to bring out. It's those capacities that I don't think there's ever been a Darwinian explanation for. They just, they're far more than is needed to assist reproduction. In fact, that's true all the way up, by the way. If you want a mind that's really successful at reproducing, look at the cockroach. There's nothing about the human mind as such, which in fact gives a Darwinian advantage. So that's what I'm getting at, is the mind is, I think, just not explained by this type of mechanism.
But if you go on successful reproduction, if you really want to stand on that, then the evolution of society by the higher brain means that they would be successful in reproducing. I don't...
Oh, well, social patterns can produce reproductive success is not what I was inclined to deny, because we see those in insects, too.
The other question was, you commented on the fact that bacteria, we started with bacteria, and bacteria are still here. But things as well as complex organisms in addition to bacteria.
Yeah, I was commenting on Steve Gould making that point, as I recall.
Yeah, what was the problem that you had with that?
I don't have a problem with that. I think bacteria are still here.
They are?
But the point is...
What I meant was, how is it an argument against evolution?
See, the problem is... Here's the problem. I think that Gould is recognizing when he points that out or whatever. And when he insists so much that there's been no progress in evolution. This whole idea that you can explain complex features because they contribute to reproductive success, it ends up, when you look at it very carefully, it doesn't have any content. Because the thing that's the best at reproducing is the thing that was there at the first. So, all of the things that exist are successful to an extent in reproducing, or they wouldn't still be around. I mean, that's certainly true. But if you look at the things which are closest to human beings, for example, like chimpanzees and gorillas, they're not evolutionary successes in the sense of Darwinian values. They're very narrowly, continuing to maintain a foothold in life. So once something's in existence, you can say, well, wow, whatever it's got must be helping it to reproduce, because otherwise it wouldn't be around. But the explanation lacks content, in terms of explaining any particular feature.
The idea behind that, as far as evolution goes, is, this is the last comment, and then I'll go away. Hold the applause. Is that no organism came that could reproduce better than the bacteria. Therefore, the bacteria was the king of the hill, the king of its niche. So a new organism came and developed a new niche, walking around, crawling in water, whatever. Then once a dominant organism filled that niche, a new organism came and perhaps learned to fly, learned to reason, form society. None of those interfere with bacteria.
That's right. There's no problem about why bacteria are still around. The problem is why the new organisms came. You say, what mechanism produced them? Yes.
Going beyond adaptation and selection, natural selection, back to the origin of life itself, assuming we can get past the black box of matter existing in the first place, was Darwinism ever meant to explain? It seems like you've alluded to that it's being used to extrapolate that was Darwinism ever meant to explain non-living matter being changed into living matter? Because I think it's obvious that life perpetuates itself, but was Darwin ever meant to explain that transition, that primordial sea transition from non-living to living?
Yeah, well, that's a question I can answer very definitely. Was Darwinism ever meant to explain the ultimate origin of life, chemical evolution or whatever? Well, the Darwinian theory properly does not. It starts with life forms and explains how they diversify and so on. In the strict sense, the answer is that it wasn't. On the other hand, Darwin himself made the seminal contribution to chemical evolution in a letter which he wrote, which is still much quoted, in which he said, perhaps in a warm little pond, the chemicals of the right kind and nutrients came together and started this process off. That was immediately an issue, and immediately seen as the next step in the program. Because you see, the program that made Darwinism such an important theory, why did people care about it so much? Why did it fire so much excitement worldwide? Why did it become the dominant intellectual idea of the end of the 19th century, and of the 20th century? It's because it seemed to create the possibility of fulfilling this agenda of explaining the entire world in materialistic terms. So, of course, you obviously had to extend it to that next step, and that was immediately recognized by Darwin as well as others what had to be done. But it isn't what his theory proper, addressed. That's certainly correct. Yes?
Hi, Professor Johnson. I'm John Hardy. My question is, what's your view on free will and the idea that basically the question of life is unknown or unknowable, and due to that we are given the freedom to choose between the Creator and nihilism?
Yeah. Well, humans do seem to have freedom to choose. I have very little wisdom to add to what the wise people of the past have been able to read have said about this. I like Samuel Johnson's, the great literary scholar's explanation of this the best. He said the thing about freedom of will, he said, all analysis is against it and all science, and all experience is for it. That we exercise freedom of choice is something we know by primary data. We are immediately conscious of it. But it's a great problem. One of the things about free will that's so fascinating is it's a problem for the materialist. Where does it come from? And materialist theories, always have a deep struggle with that. But in honesty, I have to admit it's just as big a problem for the theist. Look at Calvin and Augustine and so on, who are trying to reconcile God's foreknowledge and governance of things with humans' ability to have freedom and so on. And I am not aware of anybody who ever succeeded in advancing very far with that. It just seems to be a paradox of our existence. The other thing I most like in an explanation of free will is that in John Milton's great poem, Paradise Lost, the devil and his angels are cast out of heaven because they've rebelled against God. And they're there in hell, the pit of flame and all of this. And Satan goes off to tempt Adam and Eve. Well, while Satan is off doing his dirty work, the devils have to have something to do. So what do they do while he's gone? Well, as Milton explains it, some of them go off exploring, some of them go mountain climbing, some of them hold athletic contests, and the intellectuals among them debate free will and determinism. And he says, and they never get anywhere. It's just arguments that go round and round in circles. So that's my experience with that. I believe in free will, but I don't know how to explain it.
Yes, Professor Johnson, I was hoping that you could explain to me or define what you mean by scientific complexity. Numerous times you've mentioned that in your...
the complexity. Yeah, let me explain. I have, I think, explained it, but let me try in the most direct way. That just think about a book. A book contains information. Now, it can contain a lot of information or a little information, and it depends not just on the size of the book, but on the nature of the information. Suppose that a book has the same phrase, I love you, let us say, repeated on every page for 1,000 pages, 1,000 times on each page. How much information does it contain? Well, not very much. It contains I love you, repeat until you get to the end. And so you're reducing all of that to a simple formula. Now let's say that the book is Hamlet, the play, or something that we're all familiar with. How much information does that contain? Well, you see, a great deal more, because you cannot reduce that to a formula. You have to write the whole thing out. You can't reduce it to a simple formula. That's what makes it irreducible. It is impossible. When you try to do the calculations of how some chance combination of letters can come together to form even to be or not to be, in a coherent statement, you begin to get multiples of powers to the 50th power, 10 to the 50th, and so they're immediately way beyond any scope of possibility that we allow to any events in the real world. And when you're talking about very lengthy, irreducibly complex information, it's something that cannot be produced by chance. Now, it might conceivably be produced if there were part waypoints, if you could get a little bit of it at a time and it could be accumulated. But of course, to do that, you have to have a plan of what you're trying to accumulate. Now, what the information theory says about the information in living things is that it's irreducible information, and a lot of it that's recorded in matter, but is something that's entirely different from the material system. So, to try to get that out of material processes is like trying to get Hamlet, out of ingenious combinations of ink and paper. It's a mistaken enterprise. That's what I'm talking about.
Right. The reason I ask is because it seems only to me to be a matter of how simple we can explain life as, or how complex it seems. In the book about the beak finches, and your description of it, you described it as, and the natural determination afterwards was, because we can observe it and because it's simple enough, we can then just make a naturalistic description of life. But in the other book, The Black Box of Darwin, you said, well, we can prove that life is so complex that it didn't involve.
It is complex, yeah. The information is irreducibly complex. They're both consistent. I don't understand.
The question is, well, if you're more intelligent to understand it, or less intelligent that you can't understand either, it's just a question of how smart you are to say it's complex. If you're...
No, it's the information that's complex, not the person that's watching the information. Well, that's complex too, but...
It's just a question of how complex does it have to be to really prove that there's a creator.
Yeah. Well, I don't. Look, this is not should not be so difficult. A lot of people find this analysis very mysterious, but we make this kind of a determination all the time. One of the examples that's used, Carl Sagan, who's a very devout scientific materialist and would be very horrified at this idea you can't make life by chemical means, has this project, the SETI project. And what he's doing is looking into outer space to get signals that might come from an intelligent life. How would you recognize the signal as coming from intelligent life? It's simply by the complexity of the information content. How do archaeologists know that they're dealing with a painting that has to be by a human hand as opposed to something that can be produced by natural erosion? It's the same kind of analysis, and it's done in science all the time. Now, again, I want to say, I don't put things dogmatically. I don't say that because you've got the complex of information, it can't be produced by some means or whatever. Somebody can show the contrary. But I'm saying what they've got to show. You say, what I won't accept is that they can say, well, because we would like to have a materialist explanation, therefore one exists. I think we're about at the last question.
One more?
Last question, I'm afraid, yeah. We have to disappoint somebody, but...
Dr. Johnson, primitive man used God to explain the sun coming up and setting every day. Before Darwinism, we used God to explain our existence. Now you use God to explain the mind. It seems like God is being used to explain less and less. Will God disappear?
Yeah. That is the naturalistic understanding of the way that things have gone. That you see, God has been replaced by a scientific understanding. Now, see, in point of fact, this isn't what happens at all. When we understand how something works by scientific means, we understand how the Creator is accomplishing an objective, how the Creator's system operates, and it doesn't replace a God. Darwinism attempts to replace God by explaining the origin of all of these things, in terms of this completely materialist system. Now, I don't know if that would succeed, even if it's true, but lots of people would say, that you still need the Creator to explain the underlying laws and mechanisms. But the fact is that this effort has been unsuccessful. See, that's what we've got to discuss. If you are going to assume that the Darwinian materialist explanation of life has been successful, and therefore we don't need to have intelligence or whatever in it, then I guess you tend to think that in, sort of in all other areas this is going to succeed and occupy the whole space. But what I believe to be the case is that this explanation has totally failed. And that what has happened is that the Creator is coming back into the system not as a very distant creator of laws, but as something that is very necessary as an intelligence to account for the source of information. Now, this can be met by scientific demonstrations, but not by sarcasm or just a dismissal, it seems to me. It's going to take more than that. So thank you all very much for coming, and enjoyed your participation.